JonBenét's family now hoping that, plus renewed public interest and new DNA technology, might finally help close this case.
For nearly 30 years, one name has haunted American true crime like almost no other: JonBenét Ramsey. A 6-year-old girl, a beauty pageant queen with a smile that seemed too bright for the tragedy that followed, found dead in the basement of her own home the day after Christmas, 1996. A ransom note longer and stranger than almost any in criminal history. A family thrust into suspicion they never asked for, and a police department that fumbled the most important hours of the investigation before it had even begun. For decades, the case sat in a strange limbo. Never closed, never solved, endlessly discussed, endlessly disputed. But something has shifted. In late 2025 and into 2026, bolder investigators have started talking again, using words they hadn't used in years. New evidence, new interviews, new DNA leads. Is this finally the beginning of the end for one of America's most infamous mysteries? Or is it just another false dawn in a case that has broken hearts and expectations more times than anyone can count? Let's dig into what's actually happening right now and what it would take to really solve this. To understand why this case still grips the country, you have to go back to the beginning. On the morning of December 26, 1996, Patsy Ramsey found a long, unusual handwritten note on the staircase of the family's large Boulder home. It wasn't a typical ransom note. It ran nearly 3 pages, demanded a strangely specific sum of money, and read almost like something out of a movie. Patsy called police, believing her daughter had been kidnapped. What followed was, by nearly every account since, a case study in how not to investigate a crime scene. Officers initially treated it as a kidnapping rather than a possible homicide, so the house was never properly sealed off. Family, friends, and even a family minister moved freely through rooms that should have been preserved untouched. Hours later, it was JonBenét's own father, John Ramsey, who found her body in a small room in the basement. She had been struck on the head and strangled with a garrote fashioned from cord and a broken paintbrush that belonged to her mother's art supplies. The mistakes compounded from there. Investigators allowed John and Patsy to be interviewed together rather than separately, a basic step that could have helped rule things in or out early. JonBenét's body was moved before it was fully documented in place. Evidence sat untested for years. By the time DNA testing caught up to what the case actually needed, critical windows of opportunity had already closed. For years, public suspicion circled the Ramsey family almost exclusively, an outcome that many investigators and journalists now openly acknowledge was shaped as much by early police missteps and media narratives as by actual evidence. A grand jury reportedly considered charges against the parents, but the district attorney at the time concluded there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. Then, in 2008, testing on touch DNA recovered from JonBenét's clothing led Boulder's district attorney to formally clear the entire Ramsey family, stating the unidentified male DNA profile did not match any relative. By then, Patsy Ramsey had already died of ovarian cancer in 2006, having spent the last decade of her life under a cloud of suspicion she was never proven to deserve. John Ramsey has spent the years since campaigning, sometimes furiously, for the case to be pursued using modern forensic tools. He's met with multiple Boulder police chiefs, publicly pushed back against the department when he felt it was stalling, and more recently has praised the current chief, Stephen Redfern, for what he describes as a real shift in the department's seriousness about the case. Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's older brother, was 9 years old at the time of her death and has never been charged with anything, though internet theories have circled him relentlessly for years. He has largely avoided the spotlight, though he has occasionally spoken publicly about how the case has shaped his life and about wanting the investigation pushed forward using new DNA science. So here's where things get interesting. Boulder police have said, repeatedly and on the record, that this case remains a top priority for the department nearly 30 years on. In their most recent annual update, Chief Redfern confirmed detectives have conducted several new interviews and re-interviewed people based on incoming tips, and that additional evidence has been collected, tested and retested using techniques that simply didn't exist in the 1990s or even the 2000s. The department has stressed that DNA testing technology keeps evolving, and that this evolution is central to why they believe the case is still solvable. That's not just police talk for the cameras. It lines up with a broader shift happening across American law enforcement. Forensic genetic genealogy, the same category of technique that helped identify the Golden State Killer after more than 40 years, has cracked hundreds of cold cases nationwide by tracing distant relatives of unknown DNA contributors through consumer genealogy databases. Former law enforcement officials who've studied the Ramsey case have pointed to exactly this kind of technique as the most realistic path forward, given that investigators have unidentified male DNA from the crime scene, but no direct match to a known suspect. As of the most recent reporting, labs have been working through comparisons on both old and newly cataloged evidence, with results anticipated in the weeks around the case's 30th anniversary. But it's important to be honest about where things stand. As of now, there's been no public announcement of a confirmed match, no named suspect, and no arrest. Investigators have been careful to say that new testing renews the possibility of a breakthrough. It does not yet prove one has happened. Just when it seemed like the science might finally be catching up to the case, a separate scandal threw a wrench into the works. A former DNA analyst with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, who worked on cases throughout the exact period much of the Ramsey evidence would have passed through state labs, pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges, including manipulating results and deleting forensic records across thousands of cases over her career. That revelation forced investigators and the Ramsey family alike to ask an uncomfortable question. How much of the older evidence in this specific case can still be trusted? Fortunately, much of the DNA evidence central to the JonBenét investigation was processed through an outside laboratory rather than the compromised state lab, which offers some insulation from the scandal. But it has reignited John Ramsey's long-standing frustration that evidence in his daughter's case wasn't handled with the consistency and rigor it deserved. He has pointed out that some crime scene items were submitted for advanced analysis, while others were left untested, and he has questioned whether cost or bureaucratic caution, rather than genuine investigative judgment, drove those choices. He's now pushing to help fund private genetic genealogy testing himself, rather than wait indefinitely on institutional timelines. Even with new science entering the picture, the original case remains riddled with details that have never been fully explained. 2 sets of footprints were found near the scene that investigators were never able to identify. A length of rope discovered near JonBenét's bedroom, unconnected to anything the family owned, was reportedly never subjected to testing. Snow on the ground outside the house showed no footprints leading to or from it, despite a broken basement window that suggested a possible point of entry, a contradiction that has fueled both intruder theories and theories of someone already inside. The ransom note itself remains one of the strangest artifacts in American crime history. Unusually long, written on paper from inside the house, seemingly practiced in places before the final draft, and signed with initials that have never been definitively decoded. Handwriting analysts were never able to conclusively tie it to anyone in or outside the family. Over the years, a rotating cast of possible suspects has emerged and faded. A man who had played Santa Claus for the family and later expressed strange attachment to JonBenét. A neighbor with a disturbing criminal history who made an alarming comment to a friend after her death, and a man years later who falsely confessed to the killing entirely, only to be ruled out when his DNA and alibi didn't match. Some experts have even floated the theory that traced DNA on JonBenét's clothing came from the manufacturing process rather than an assailant, since small amounts of biological material could transfer onto new garments before they're ever worn, a possibility that, if true, would undercut one of the case's most talked about leads. Experts who've studied the case are candid about both the promise and the limits of where forensic science stands today. Genetic genealogy specialists have noted that this technique excels when there's a usable DNA profile to work from, but with mixed, degraded, or extremely limited samples, the science still has real boundaries. Some forensic professionals working with the Ramsey evidence have expressed caution about rushing any single lab's results, given how finite and fragile the remaining physical evidence is after nearly 3 decades of storage. Prosecutors would also face genuine legal hurdles even if a single unidentified profile were finally matched to a real person. Statutes of limitations don't apply to first-degree murder, but building a case strong enough to survive trial 3 decades after the fact, with evidence that has already been mishandled once, is an entirely different challenge than simply identifying a name. Still, there is real momentum behind this case in a way there hasn't been in years. Boulder police continue to describe this as a top departmental priority. They've explicitly said claims that the department is sitting on unpursued leads are false, and they've invited anyone with information, no matter how small it might seem, to come forward. Strip away the decades of tabloid coverage, the internet forums, the endless docuseries, and what's left is simple and devastating. A 6-year-old girl who loved to dance and perform, who lit up a room, whose life ended in her own basement on what should have been an ordinary winter morning. Her father, now in his 80s, has spent almost 30 years refusing to let her case fade into cold case obscurity, meeting with chief after chief, pushing for testing, publicly advocating for the same techniques that have cracked other decades-old mysteries. Her brother, who was a child himself when all of this happened, has spent his adult life carrying a story that was never his to tell, but that followed him anyway. Whatever the coming months bring, a real DNA match, another dead end, or simply more waiting, the case remains open for a reason that has nothing to do with entertainment value and everything to do with the fact that nobody has ever been held accountable for what happened to JonBenét Ramsey. If you have any information related to this case, Boulder police have said it is never too late to come forward. As for the rest of us, all we can do is keep watching and hope that this time, the science finally catches up to the truth. There's also something worth remembering about why this particular case has held the public's attention for 3 decades when so many other tragedies fade from memory within a news cycle. Part of it is the imagery, the pageant photos, the wealthy Boulder home, the strange formality of that ransom note. But part of it is also the sense of unfinished business, a feeling that somewhere out there, someone knows exactly what happened that night and has simply never been asked the right question or hasn't been caught by the right piece of evidence yet. Every few years, a new detail resurfaces, a new expert weighs in, a new lab announces it's taking another look, and the case briefly feels solvable again. Sometimes that hope fades quickly. This time, at least, it's backed by a police department willing to say publicly that the investigation isn't stalled, a father in his 80s still fighting for answers, and forensic techniques that have already proven capable of cracking cases just as cold. Whether all of that